Would Donald Trump's China tariffs spark a trade war? After propelling his presidential campaign with plans to reclaim jobs lost to China and place steep tariffs on the Asian economic giant's imports, President-elect Donald Trump took an interesting turn Thursday night as he began discussing Chinese foreign policy, just before diving into his views on how the U.S. and China should get along over the course of the next few years. During a speech in Iowa, Trump offered a tough-to-debate assessment of where things currently stand. "They're not great. One of the most important relationships we have to improve, is our relationship with China," he told the crowd in Des Moines. Few on either side of the aisle would debate that sentiment on its face. China's recent activity in the South China Sea has at times prompted responses from U.S. military vessels, including a sojourn by a Navy warship in October. And while the two countries haven't come to blows by any means, America's presence in the region undoubtedly has rankled those in Chinese President Xi Jinping's administration. On the economic front, aside from Trump's accusations of Chinese currency manipulation, the Commerce Department earlier this year slapped certain Chinese steel imports with significantly higher tariffs, accusing the country's steelmakers of importing product into the U.S. at an unfair price. A snafu involving President Barack Obama at a Chinese airport, meanwhile, raised more than a few eyebrows in September, after Air Force One touched down in China's Hangzhou region for this year's Group of 20 summit meeting. A set of stairs that would have allowed the president to disembark normally was nowhere to be found. The scenario was widely interpreted as a Chinese snub of the U.S. president, though the reality seems to point more to chaotic confusion than intentional slight. So by beginning his China comments in this manner Thursday night, admitting that things could be better between the two countries, Trump appeared to be setting himself up to temper his oft-repeated, hard-line trade stance that many economists and onlookers have been losing sleep over. But then Trump continued, "The nation of China is responsible for almost half of America's trade deficit," he said. "You have the massive theft of intellectual property, putting unfair taxes on our companies, not helping with the menace of North Korea like they should, and the at-will and massive devaluation of their currency and their product dumping. Other than that, they've been wonderful." Right. Trump's China-related proposals, particularly his calls to slap fees on Chinese imports, have already engendered skepticism. Steep tariffs, some analysts say, ultimately could end up hurting the economies of both the U.S. and China. If he starts throwing around trade barriers to China and Mexico, they're going to retaliate. And that's not a good outcome at all, says John Cannelly, chief economic strategist at LPL Financial. Mr. Trump could fulfill some of his campaign promises on trade or on immigration, but those same policies are likely to hurt businesses, both small and large, in the long run. Trump is correct in noting America's trade deficit with China is larger than it is with any other country, though there's some research out there that suggests such deficits by themselves aren't inherently good or bad for global economies. Through October, America was running a $288.8 billion trade deficit with China in 2016, a figure that accounted for more than 47% of the country's overall international shortfall, according to the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Driving that gap, China is far and away the biggest importer of goods to the U.S., though it's worth noting it was also the third largest buyer of American-made products last year, behind Canada and Mexico. Trump has charged that America's trade deficit with China exists because it has stolen production jobs from the U.S. and through currency manipulation and price undercutting. Trump says China is boxing American producers out of the international market. Whether these jobs can actually be recovered, though, is another question entirely. Robert Scott, senior economist and director of trade and manufacturing policy research at the left-leaning Economic Policy Institute, in a July paper said America's recent trade deficits inflated by currency manipulation by China and others, is largely responsible for the loss of more than 5 million U.S. manufacturing jobs. But Scott goes on to say that Trump's trade agenda, heavily reliant on higher tariffs, is not based on a coherent analysis of why globalization and trade and investment deals have hurt U.S. workers, and what should be done about it. Additionally, technological advancement is believed to have rendered at least some of the jobs America lost over the last few decades obsolete. If you'd gotten tough on China 15 or 20 years ago, you could have prevented some of the job migrations, Kevin O'Mara, Chief Content Officer at supply chain-focused organization SCM World, told U.S. News in an interview earlier this year, calling Trump's China rhetoric saber-rattling. Those jobs aren't coming back. Some analysts had hoped that Trump would pivot to more moderate trade territory following his Election Day win. Dan Atkinson, director of the Herbert A. Stiefel Center for Trade Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, wrote last month that if he diversifies his advisors, there is a reasonable chance that President Trump's actions will be less bellicose than his rhetoric, because someone who wants to make America great again will want the policies implemented by his administration to help grow the economy. But the substance of the president-elect's China message on Thursday was little changed from what was heard throughout his successful run for the White House. Chinese officials haven't played by the rules, and I know it's time they're going to start. They're going to start, Trump said. My administration will follow two simple rules: buy American and hire American. This decision to play what, for now, is rhetorical hardball with the second-largest economy in the world and one of the largest drivers of international trade has some analysts on the lookout for a trade war, a conflict Trump might be able to start without congressional intervention. And though a recent report from Fitch Ratings wagered that a sharp increase in protectionism would be resisted by U.S. corporate lobbyists and mainstream Republican legislators, Robert Shapiro, chairman of consulting outfit SunCon and former U.S. Undersecretary of Commerce for Economic Affairs, notes that Trump ultimately would be able to call some tariff-related shots. He can do that on his own, Shapiro says, noting that the bottom line of Trump's economics is a trade war. He can impose tariffs on China and Mexico, our two leading trade partners, without congressional approval. Just how bad would that look? It's hard to say, especially because it's difficult to predict how other nations and trade partners would react. But the outcome likely wouldn't be good for China or the U.S. Joseph Quinlan, head of market and thematic strategy at Bank of America's Global Wealth and Investment Management Division, wrote in an October report that if the United States ever did initiate a trade war with China, the financial consequences to the U.S. could be devastating. O'Mara also points out that China probably would have no trouble surviving a trade war with us, as big as the United States is as a market. We are not growing from a consumer goods standpoint anywhere near as fast as India, Brazil, Indonesia, you name it, he says. Getting tough with China, especially if it really does precipitate a trade war, would immediately lead to parts shortages and finished products shortages in practically every industry that we have. That's not to say a trade war at this point is a foregone conclusion, but many economists have predicted the U.S. economy will be in for a bumpy ride if Trump sticks to his guns and attempts to strong-arm its Asian rival.